Introduce yourselves if you don't mind, however you like, using your pronouns, if you wouldn't mind.
So I'm Constantino Khalaf. My pronouns are he, him, and I identify as a cisgender gay man.
My name is David. I'm married to Constantino, and I identify as a cisgender gay man also, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
Yeah, I'm not that much taller than you. You just look a lot shorter.
I'm just comfortable.
And I can hear a puppy in the background. What's the puppy?
And we have recent puppies, so there may be a little bit of yelping every now and then.
So y'all provided some responses for the Q chats, specifically the segment on sexuality and shame, which I thought I'm really excited about. And I was reading through your answers, and I just think the world of you guys. Like your answers and your responses were brilliant. I thought they were thought-provoking, and so a couple of things came up for me. But how would you, I'm going to just kind of throw the questions out there that you guys responded to, and then I'll kind of add some layers on top of those. But how would you briefly describe your viewpoints related to sexual ethics specifically?
Go for it. Well, that's a big question, so I'll let you start. Briefly.
Yeah, I strongly believe really the most important piece in any sexual ethic should be consent.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I feel like that's not always talked about, but that's should be the main thing. My ethics have evolved as I've grown older. I've got to understand sex as a means of communication,
mm-hmm.
and I think ultimately for me, I decided that what I wanted as far as my sexual ethics was to figure out what I'm saying through the sexual act,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And is it, I'm lonely at this moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what I'm communicating.
Mm-hmm.
Is it saying, I need something?
Mm-hmm.
Is it saying, I love you? And just go build my sexual ethics around the question of what do I want to communicate via sex.
Right. I love that. One of your favorite quotes that I highlighted in my notes here is, we use sex to say a number of things, from I'm lonely to I love you, from I'm yours to I have power over you. In my opinion, which you wrote, a sound sexual ethic is one that examines what one wishes to convey through sex, one that asks, what am I saying when I have sex? And this is kind of that conversation you're referring to. And
yeah,
I think that's brilliant, because we are in many ways talking through our sexuality and kind of using it as a way of getting what we need and soothing ourselves, or provoking our partners to provide that, and that in many ways could be unhealthy.
Yeah, well, that was well put. I guess more and more as I'm thinking about sexual ethics, I've been trying to think about ethics absent of kind of rules, and giving it how can we give it a framework without instilling kind of a rule-based structure on it.
Sure.
And we've actually, even in our church community, have been talking about ethics, sexual ethics specifically, but kind of ethics as a whole. And one conversation that we've been having that I really like has been around what the acts that I'm engaged in and the relationships that I'm engaged in. What is the trajectory of that? Is it leading towards something that's good? Is it leading towards something that's a consummation of full and healthy love? And for me, that's been a really healthy, good way for me to think about sexual ethics as a whole, because it's less about what's the rule and what's right in kind of a universal standard, but rather creating space for there to be a variety of potential life choices
Mm-hmm.
based on answering the question, like, is it good for me, and is it kind of leading me toward a more like full, robust, healthy love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. When I read your answer initially, it made me think of James Fowler, who's a developmental theorist, who said out of 6 stages, most of us live in stage number 3, and that is like swimming around in the fishbowl, because our community swims around in the fishbowl. But then level 4 is when we get out of the fishbowl and we start examining why. And we start asking that very important question, why am I participating in this? Do you know what happened for you in your development that kicked you out of level 3 into level 4, where you started asking about these why questions and challenging the rules?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I was in reparative therapy on and off for 6 years, and I was in men's healing groups for another 10 years after that, and I really believed that what God wanted for my life was to either change my attractions or have me be content in celibacy, even though I never really felt content in celibacy. And for me, the moment was in these men's healing groups, which I'd been in for so long. There was a moment when one of my friends said, I have nothing more to give. It's taking all of my energy just to obey. And God can't ask anything else of me. He was just like a clenched fist. And all of his energy, all of his effort was just focused inward, just in trying to control his desires based on what he believed for himself. And I looked around and I said, you know what, like what I'm in right now is not life-giving. I don't see fruit in what we're doing here. And that was a real aha moment that maybe this framework of ethics that I had handed down to me was not working and was not good. And, I say that kind of separately from people who really choose celibacy freely for themselves, which is great, and that's wonderful. A lot of the men in these groups that I was in really wanted to be in relationship and felt like they couldn't. And so for me, looking around saying, you know what, I don't see fruit growing out of this framework is not working. I have to step out of that and really kind of look beyond what God may be saying to me.
In other words, getting out of the water and really creating an opportunity to listen.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And just, listening to God rather than listening to, everyone else who had answers.
Yeah. One of the things you wrote was, you said it's important for us to search earnestly and honestly to discern and develop our own sexual ethic. What's one of the reasons why you believe so deeply in that? I mean, I can hear it subliminally in what you're saying, but why establish our own? Why not trust the community?
Yeah, I think there's value in the wisdom of community and the wisdom of tradition. But when we, it's kind of in the same ways our belief is, you may have heard it framed as our faith tradition is like a tripod, and you've got the Bible as one leg, and you've got community or tradition as another leg, and you've got experience as a third leg. And if we rely too heavily on one of those, then we topple over.
Sure.
And I feel like many of us, especially many of us who have come from really conservative or strongly evangelical backgrounds, rely heavily on the Bible leg, and maybe secondarily on the community or tradition leg. And we give very little attention to the experience leg. And more I'm coming to believe there's a place for all of them. But I think there's just something really important about paying attention to our experience and what we're seeing in our lives.
Right.
And if something that we're reading in the Bible or our tradition says that we experience we have in our experiences harmful in some way, we're experiencing that this is not good for ourselves, or it's not doing justice to other people, then I think our experience really needs to speak to those other two legs and say something here is not quite jiving.
I love that. Actually, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I love that. And especially when the experience leg is the leg that has been almost cut off, right? Especially for like LGBTQ people, we're told to like. So I think building out that leg again is important, and we should value that. And yeah,
absolutely.
No, I was looking for a blog post idea. That's perfect.
There you go. Well, let us know when it's ready.
Yeah.
I do, especially as personally, and even as a psychotherapist, but I really put a lot of emphasis on the experiential or the experiences of God rather than just what people are telling me of God. Because I think that there's so much shame that can live when we only rely on the Bible leg of this tripod and we're cutting off the experiential leg. What, for you, Dave, did shame feel like in terms of sex and sexual ethics?
Well, it's interesting. My relationship with shame was this weird kind of worship of shame, because in my reparative therapy experience, my therapist framed shame and the feeling of shame as my true self breaking out and my true self telling me, reacting with like revulsion toward my attractions. And so whenever I felt shame, in a way, it was a good thing because it was my true self telling me to reject what my feelings were. And so it was like this weird, almost like codependent relationship where like I couldn't shake my shame because I felt like it was a necessary part of my growth, and it was an important indicator telling me if I was doing something wrong or unnatural. And so it really took me kind of breaking out of that fishbowl for me to realize how destructive shame was in my life. And there's a time and place for shame, but for most of us, like I feel like 95% of the shame we feel is just destructive.
Yeah. I agree. There's some of my favorite authors in this particular area is Teresa and Don, and they're out of a university in Chicago, and they write that some of us use shame as a penance, like we have to keep it around, like a rosary that hangs on our wall or around our neck, that we have to keep it as a way of saying, if I can shame myself enough, then and only then does God know that I'm really sorry. And we're using shame to medicate the shame, which is just like this compounding effect.
Yeah. Oh, I can relate to that so much.
How did you, this segment is moving beyond shame. How did you move beyond?
For me, it was moving into a relationship with Tino. Once there was no cure for shame, and we've had a number of people write into us or come talk to us when we've done, talks about sex and shame, about how we just like, what's the cure for shame? And for me, the biggest thing was being fully vulnerable and fully seen, and by Tino most importantly, and having his affirmation and having him see what felt like the dirtiest, ickiest, most perverse parts of myself, and have him love and affirm those, and then having that as a kind of anchor or secure base, I was then able to go out and be more open and vulnerable with other people, because shame dies in the light of vulnerability. And so being able to be vulnerable with other people and risking in that way, knowing that I had an anchor in Tino, helped me to bit by bit kind of chip away at that shame. And I remember one day having this realization when I was fully out and I had told even the scary people in my life who I was afraid to tell about my sexuality, and had come to a kind of like, either they accepted me or we at least, had a good talk about it. I had this moment where I'm like, I don't feel shame anymore. And it was this strange absence, this really wonderful absence. And it was because I was fully vulnerable and fully known to the world. And it wasn't necessarily that everyone agreed or affirmed me, but it was my ability to be vulnerable and still have some really important people in my life affirm me.
My goodness, that just sounds so like life transforming.
Oh yeah.
Oh my gosh, for sure. What was that like for you, Tino, to watch him go through that process, to see him come in with shame and then shake it off right in front of you?
It was both beautiful, and I think I didn't realize what was happening until, in hindsight, right? Because I don't know, I love him, and I think because I didn't have the same struggles with shame, I didn't fully understand the burden he had been carrying. So, he's easy to love, so I wasn't, I didn't feel like I was doing a whole lot more than just recognizing the amazing guy that he is, and like just being, I don't know. So it wasn't honestly until we started kind of like talking more about this that I started realizing how, there's nothing special about me. I think it was just the nature. I think it was just the nature of being in relationship, So it's beautiful to hear him speak about it now, I think that's more just a testament to the power of vulnerability and the safety that being in a loving relationship can generate, than anything particularly special about me or you're special.
You guys are like totally like activating the attachment psychotherapist in me. I love it. One of the things you said, Tino, was it was easy to love him. I think that a lot of parents don't find it easy to love their LGBTQ plus child in this area of sex and sexuality. What do you feel like was the emotional component that you carried that allowed you to love him so easily and watch him kind of deconstruct the shame?
That's a good question. I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I wonder if actually some of it came from kind of like my own woundedness, right? And my own, I would say I've never struggled much with shame. I struggle with guilt. So I think because I haven't felt shame for being gay, I think what he saw as his biggest, flaw or the biggest thing to be ashamed of, I never saw it as shameful. Like I never, going back 20 years ago when I came out, like even back then, the whole the cliche scenario of if there were a pill you could take to make you straight, would you take that pill? My answer was honestly, I never said yes. Right? Like I kind of always accepted there's been a fallout with my family and all this stuff, but I never felt that being gay was bad. So I think it was maybe that was the component was just what he saw as his biggest source of shame. I didn't see it as such.
Almost like you
So-
could hold that space for him.
Yeah,
The space where it was beautiful and lovely and clean.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I remember having a conversation once where, we were talking. I forget even like the context. It was something about, his feelings, his inner conflict about loving me.
Mhm.
And I think I remember saying something about like, well, just don't think of me as a guy. I'm just me,
Mhm.
right? I'm just Tino.
Mhm.
And because I think that's how I always saw same gender love, was just, this is just the person,
It's just love.
Yeah. And I think that conversation was for you a little bit of a like aha moment.
Had lots of aha moments.
I bet you did. I'm gonna maybe you don't have some thoughts around this, but for you, Dave, what did it feel like to practice this incredible vulnerability? I mean, this wasn't like taking one step forward on a sidewalk. This was like hopping from one side of a cliff on the other side of a canyon to another side of it, like another cliff edge.
Yeah. Terrifying.
Yeah.
And full of fits and starts for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We started to date, and I was technically out, but I really didn't offer information about my sexuality unless asked,
Mm-hmm.
which meant that there were a lot of very casual friends in my life who didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
And so dating was this ongoing coming out process, and I felt as if I were, by no fault of Tino, forced to like come out consistently over and over again
Mm-hmm.
for this period of like 2 or 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just felt constantly vulnerable and constantly on guard at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't always feel like having those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were times when I would lie or omit truth.
Mm-hmm.
There were times when Tina would meet some casual friends of mine, and I would just say, hey, this is Tino.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that he was my boyfriend. I wouldn't acknowledge his role in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And, I could see that was a bit hurtful to him, and I was really convicted personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I reached a kind of point where I said, you know what, like, I need to be all in if this relationship is going to work.
Mm-hmm.
I need to be all in with him, and I need to be all in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the kind of cliff moment that you mentioned, where I really had to just like dive in and trust
Mm-hmm.
the relationship, just trust my own strength, and then really just trust God, because up until then I had been taking these really baby steps and checking in with God and saying, is this okay, God? Can I do this, God?
Mm-hmm.
And I was never getting God doesn't talk to me a whole lot, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And so there got to be a point where I just had to say, you know what, God, I have to trust that that you're in this with me, and I'm just going to jump in, and I'm going to stay in tune with you and be constantly listening to your voice as best I can.
Mm-hmm.
But I just need to take that step off the cliff. I had spent too long kind of waddling back and forth along the edge of the cliff, and at some point I think we just have to make that jump.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I resonate with you a ton here. When I met my partner, Joe, a long time ago, I was in seminary, and that was, oh my gosh, a very long time ago, almost 10 years ago. I was not affirming, and I would never call him my boyfriend. We moved into a one-bedroom apartment, and I made him set up the extra spare futon in the room so that some nights I could sleep there, and definitely so when mom and dad came over, they would see that there were 2 beds, And it was the most destructive process for us when we would have sex and then wake up in the morning, and then I would be flooded with shame and tell him things like, we can never do this again, or this is unbiblical, or we need to stop, and just putting so much pressure, not jumping off of that cliff edge, and holding that shame was almost a way of like infusing my shame on him. And that can be so destructive.
Oh yeah. I can relate to that kind of feeling of not only holding that shame, but I think it has the power to then kind of seep out of us and into other people if they take it on. Yeah,
absolutely.
In terms of kind of like to connect this, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like back to the why your personal experience matters when you're building out your sexual ethic and figure out what works for you. You know, we've written before about the fact that even though we don't think, you know, premarital sex is sinful at all, and, you know, we have many friends, we don't think there's an issue with that. We didn't have sex until we were married. And I think that was one of the reasons why that was good for us in our very specific scenario. It's because by the time we started having sex, the shame you have kind of like started working through it already through the process of relationship.
Well, waiting until marriage helps me to differentiate what my shame was about. Was my shame about us having sex before marriage, or was my shame about like reconciling my sexuality? And so by abstaining while we were dating, it allowed me to work through the shame, my sexuality shame, and not have that complicated by, do I feel like I'm having a sin issue by having sex before marriage, which, like Tina said,
or having sex at all.
Or having sex at all. Yeah.
Any sex with guys would feel shameful too.
Yeah. That's true. Any sex at all, even absent of like the marriage issue. So I think for me, kind of taking that out of the equation was really great, just to be able to examine the shame more clearly.
If y'all could go back in time and have your dream version of sexual ethics be taught to you, I know it's a big question, but what would be maybe the top 3 components that you would have wanted to learn as a kid?
I think for me, I would have liked what I talk about, which is the notion of sex as a conversation. I would have liked to learn about that, and specifically about it as a dialogue, right? In that so I think, going back, consent was always taught to me, and I think that was always, something I honored.
Sure.
But I have to be honest and say that, I had sexual encounters where, even though there was always consent, I don't think I was as mindful as I could have been, not only to what I was saying, but to what the other person was saying, right? And I think I could have better honored the image of the divine in my sexual partners if I had been a little bit more attuned to say, like, okay, yes, this person is consenting, but why? What are they saying?
Right.
And I think that in general would have been a much kinder and true and healthy sexual ethic, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I can kind of piggyback off that in a different way. That like I would have loved to have been taught better attunement to my feelings, because for me that's had a strong component in the way my sexual ethic is played out, because you're talking about that conversation, that dialogue. For me, I had always learned to just stuff my feelings down to the point where I just had become numb. So I and this is still something I struggle with today because it's just a habit, but I just don't feel very much.
Sure.
All my feelings, the default of my feelings is just locked down in the basement of my heart.
Mm-hmm.
And so sexuality and sexual interaction have been completely detached from emotional feeling for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we've both been sexually active before we were dating. And for me, it was very easy for me to have sexual interactions with someone without a second thought because it was totally absent of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
My feelings about it, my feelings or considerations for them
Mm-hmm.
also.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that same way, I had very little consideration about what the act meant for me or for the other person.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a physical sensation.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel in that way, it kind of was slowly like ripping at my soul.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't think, for me at least, sex is not just a physical act.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we're communicating with someone at just a much deeper, more meaningful level, even if we deny that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so being able to be more in tune with my feelings, I think, would have helped me develop a more healthy sexual ethic.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that I really use a lot, kind of on the day-to-day, is that sexuality is actually, it's housed in the part of the body or the part of our neurology that also carries resentment and aggression. And so a lot of couples where their emotional experience, or for a lot of people where their emotional experiences are kind of shoved down, it can actually create a lot of confusion around sex and sexuality. So if someone doesn't know that they're feeling unsafe, or if they don't know that they're resenting their partner, or that they're saying yes when they really mean no, it can
Mm-hmm.
actually affect the physiological reactions of the body and can be really shaming during sex. For women, they might not be able to reach orgasm, or for men, they might not be able to keep an erect penis. And that emotional information is so important when we think about our sex lives, because it requires the sexual orgasm literally requires a sensation of safety to go deep down into soothing and safety, so
Mm-hmm.
that it can shoot up into climax. And without that downward curve into safety and soothing, we can bypass the whole thing, and then sex becomes this really confusing experience. Or we shut off all emotion, and we don't know how deep and how intimate it can really feel.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so it's very complex, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of pivoting a little bit, what do you feel like other LGBTQ Christians should know about your sexual ethic?
Well, I think I would want them to know that, and that we talked this about it. It's like, I think when we, for example, talk about the fact that we abstained until we were married, it's very easy to just say, oh, they were just being puritanical, prunes or
Sure,
whatever.
sure.
Prudes.
Yes.
Those prunes. And just, I think it would be important to say, no, it's not about purity. It's about figuring out where you're at
Mm-hmm.
and what is best for you. And I think keeping in mind, I think this is important as Christians, we recognize that we all carry the image of God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not kind of what I was getting at earlier with what I wish I had been taught is not lose sight also of the image of God in the other person,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And, asking, is this other person, is having sex with me really what's best for this other person
Mm-hmm.
at this, where they are right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, I guess what I want people to know about our personal ethic is that I think we try our best to be really intentional about it. So I think we've gone into our relationship, with a lot of preconceived notions about what a sexual relationship would look like, but being able to kind of step back and maybe deconstruct a little bit and ask the questions like, what's right for us in particular, and we don't do it perfectly. I think there's a lot of missteps, but I think we're good about communicating those missteps. I think there's sometimes when we have sex and we're kind of selfish about it, or we don't have sex, but we are good about kind of communicating like what that's about. And I think that's been really important to us, is understanding our own emotions, our own sexuality, and then the dynamic between them, especially as we get older, where I'm 41 and he's 39 going on 40 for the longest time. And that interplay too, where when you're not in your 20s anymore, just like ready and wanting to have sex all the time, be intentional about that. And I don't know, is that?
Yeah, we talk about sex a lot, actually, I would say.
Yeah. I think that's really good.
Yeah, and that was true before we got married, and it's continued to be true after marriage. We talk very openly and candidly about where we're at. Like even like when we're trying to decide if we're gonna have sex that evening or not, it's like, okay, where are you at? Are you like at a 10 being like super horny, or a 1 being like not horny at all, a 5 being, hey, I could get talked into it, right? Like we talk about it that way, like, right? It's like, okay, do you want to have sex tonight? Where are you, right? So if we're both at an 8, fantastic, right? If one of us is at a 1, then let's just wait some more.
Yeah, and I think we've created also a safe culture in our relationship for exploring a little bit, even talking about those things that might seem a little bit embarrassing. And I think that's been really healthy, to be able to express like a desire or interest, and know the other person's not just gonna laugh at you.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing that really just kind of activates just like such a really cool appreciation for the way you two are talking about this is just so much consideration for the other person, where they're at, not only just in the moment, which is incredibly important, but the context of where they're coming from, and what sex means to them in this stage of life or in that moment. And I just think the level of consideration for the other person is a beautiful way of allowing them to be vulnerable, in this deep way that says, I am literally safe with you from the inside out. If you're taking care of my heart, baby, I know you're going to take care of my body, kind of a thing. And you guys are just articulating that so beautifully.
We don't do it perfectly, though. Let me make clear.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. You guys write about some of this in your book.
Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah.
We wrote a book that came out a few months ago called Modern Kinship, named after our blog, and we write a lot about sex and shame. We got a whole chapter on that. But then we write a lot about just doing relationship. We interview the Julie Gottman of the Gottman Institute and their science-based marriage therapists, marriage center, and so we interview her, and we talk a lot about their techniques and what's worked for us, because there's just a lot of wonderfully universal takeaways, no matter what kind of couple you are. And we talk a lot about just, departing from heteronormative relationships. We interviewed Rachel Held Evans and talked a lot about what it looks like to have a modern day relationship, not just for same-sex couples, but for there are progressive Christian couples who are realizing that their marriages don't fit the mold of what has been traditionally established.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's important, getting specifically to, talking about sex within the context of a relationship. I think it's so important to know that sex is just like one component of a relationship. And that's something we've seen even in our years of marriage, is that when we're doing well as a couple, our sex life is good.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not doing so well, our sex life starts to, diminish. It's like it works together.
It's the canary in the cave in the coal mine.
Yeah, and I think, it's easy. It would be easy to kind of, I feel like sex is a very visible and tangible thing to point at.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be very easy to say like, our sex life sucks.
Mm-hmm.
And point out, and that's the reason why our relationship isn't going well. But no, really, it's like it's all working together.
Exactly.
So, in our book, we talk a lot about handling conflict. Like, how do you manage conflict within a relationship? Because conflict is a natural part of being in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're working on all those things holistically in your relationship, your sex life is also going to be, part of it. So,
Absolutely. Yeah, that safety piece is right in place. When the body knows it's safe, it's going to crave intimacy. And when it doesn't know it's safe, it's not going to crave intimacy,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Where can people follow your brilliant work? How can you find you guys?
Well, so we have a website, a blog. It's daveantino.com.
Mm-hmm.
And we're on Twitter as @DaveAntino, Instagram and Facebook, Modern Kinship.
And Modern Kinship is available wherever books are sold.
There you go.
Probably not everywhere, but
Sure.
Everywhere you shop.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much for your time, guys.
Yeah,
Thank you.
awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your insight.
Yeah,
it's really
for sure.
helpful to me.